All right, let's unpack this. You know that feeling when you're watching a spy movie, right?
Yeah.
And the villain reveals his ridiculously elaborate, totally implausible master plan.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I will use a pheromone bomb to turn the entire army into lovers, or maybe I will assassinate the president using a tiny, untraceable dart that, causes a heart attack.
Yes, absolutely. That's the moment where you kind of roll your eyes and think, okay, this is definitely fiction. Governments are just too bureaucratic, right? Too risk-averse and, well, frankly, probably too logical to ever attempt something so cartoonishly absurd.
Exactly. That skepticism is like a fundamental human defense mechanism, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're sort of wired to filter out the most outlandish claims, especially when they involve, massive institutional malice or just sheer dumb governmental incompetence. But today, we are going to talk about the terrifying, documented, and absolutely real moments where the government didn't just consider the absurd, they fully planned it, paid for it, and yeah, in many cases, actually executed it.
Yeah. Okay, so our deep dive mission today is to go through, well, basically a stack of documents detailing specific events that when they were first whispered about were just dismissed as pure crazy conspiracy theories.
Right.
We're sort of moving the line between paranoia and reality here. We'll be looking at, well, everything from government attempts to manufacture war to genuinely horrifying research projects involving, believe it or not, the exploitation of the deceased.
I am prepared to be both horrified and totally hooked. So let's not waste any time.
Yeah.
We are kicking off this journey into the unbelievable with a concept that sounds like a total joke, but was actually a serious governmental project pursued by two different nations, no less. And it focuses on sexual orientation.
Okay.
We're starting with the Canadian government's attempt to build a literal gaydar.
Right. The Cold War paranoia of the 1960s was, incredibly intense. But its targets weren't always tanks and missiles, were they? Often the focus turned inward, toward, perceived weaknesses within the national structure itself.
Exactly. Our neighbors to the north, the famously polite Canadians, decided they had this massive security risk on their hands.
Yeah.
Homosexual employees.
Okay.
The prevailing theory at the time, utterly baseless, by the way, particularly within the military and law enforcement, which is primarily who the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the military brass were focused on, was that gay men were easily susceptible to blackmail. And therefore, they were national security threats. They just had to be rooted out and fired.
And this is where the absurdity really kicks in, doesn't it? Instead of just firing people based on suspicion, which, let's be honest, they were probably already doing.
Oh, for sure.
They commissioned this pseudoscientific device to prove their bias. They actually called it the fruit machine.
The name itself. It sounds like a terrible 1950s nickname for a slot machine or something. But its purpose was incredibly grim. It was developed by a scientist, Dr. Frank Robert. And its entire goal was to weed out homosexual men from sensitive government roles and the methodology behind it. That's where you truly understand how rudimentary yet, well, destructive this so-called science was.
What's fascinating, I think, is the psychological basis they tried to lean on. They weren't using high-tech surveillance or anything like that.
Oh.
They were relying on involuntary physiological responses. So the subject would be seated, right, and shown a sequence of images, some erotic featuring men, some erotic featuring women, some just neutral, alongside specific words. The documents actually call them gay buzzwords.
Gay buzzwords.
Yeah, or just emotionally charged vocabulary that was considered relevant to the gay subculture of the time.
And the device, which was usually just a small camera focused right on the person's eyes, measured one thing: pupil dilation.
Pupil dilation.
Yeah. The assumption was if you were attracted to men, your pupils would involuntarily widen when you saw those specific male erotic stimuli, regardless of what you might actually say.
So basically, this was the 1960s trying to create a biological lie detector test for sexual orientation.
Pretty much.
And the science was just fundamentally flawed, wasn't it? Pupil dilation is influenced by dozens of factors: light levels, stress, general arousal, or just, being really uncomfortable because you're being subjected to some bizarre government test with explicit photos.
Absolutely. It was never, ever proven to reliably detect orientation. Yet the results were taken deadly seriously by government administrators who were, let's face it, already predisposed to believe their employees were potential threats.
And that's the pivot, isn't it? From kind of darkly funny absurdity to genuinely tragic consequences.
Totally. Despite its complete ineffectiveness, the findings of the fruit machine led to this massive purge. Thousands of Canadian federal employees were talking. Military personnel, civil servants, law enforcement officers. They were interrogated, discriminated against, and fired.
And the sources note that this relentless persecution led to a horrific spike in suicides among those targeted. It's just awful.
Yeah. The machine might have been ridiculous, but its power to destroy lives was absolutely real.
The project itself was, thankfully, pretty short-lived. It was discontinued in the late 1960s, largely due to, well, internal questioning about its scientific validity, finally.
Right.
But the culture of suspicion it enabled, that persisted. The RCMP kept maintaining these meticulous, discriminatory files on suspected gay individuals for years and years after the physical machine was retired. It really built this institutional legacy of surveillance and fear.
So, okay, we moved from Canada trying to detect orientation to the U.S. trying to weaponize it. Which brings us to the gay bomb.
Oh boy, this is truly a low point for military imagination, I think.
Right.
The gay bomb was theorized by the United States Air Force, specifically the research labs at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It was intended as a non-lethal chemical weapon for use against enemy forces.
And unlike the Canadian project, which seemed rooted in just institutional homophobia and paranoia, the U.S. motivation here was straight out of some weird science fiction comedy. The concept, which was confirmed in a 1994 Department of Defense document that surfaced years later, was a bomb designed to dispense sexual pheromones among enemy troops.
Okay, wait. Sexual pheromones.
Yeah.
The intention, as detailed in the actual document, was that these pheromones would, quote, generate mutual attraction among enemy forces.
Generate mutual attraction.
It wasn't about, love or anything. It was about disruption. The true tactical goal was apparently to cause profound confusion, distraction, and panic within their ranks, thereby severely reducing their combat effectiveness.
When you actually read the documents, the level of detail they applied to this, frankly, outlandish idea is just astounding.
Yep.
They were genuinely exploring how to synthesize and deploy potent, universal human attractants from, like, an airplane.
Right.
It wasn't just a scribble on a napkin in some bar. This was a formal research proposal.
And the recurring theme here, I think, is the willingness of governments, especially during periods of heightened tension like the Cold War, to dedicate immense resources and, frankly, intellectual capital to projects based on deeply flawed, often discriminatory, and entirely speculative premises. It just raises this really important question for us, doesn't it?
What's that?
If the military establishment was seriously prioritizing pheromone bombs, what crucial real security threats were they neglecting, simply because these speculative tangents were maybe more dramatic, or perhaps just aligned better with existing biases? The opportunity cost of such absurdity is, well, staggering when you think about it.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. From these absurd attempts at detection and deterrence to some effective, though far darker, espionage techniques. Now, everyone's heard of Project MKUltra, right?
The LSD stuff.
Yeah, the CIA's infamous mind control experiments involving LSD and other psychedelics on, crucially, non-consenting individuals. Yeah. But let's talk about its lesser-known but equally chilling successor, Project MK Naomi.
Right. If MKUltra was focused more on psychological manipulation, maybe finding a truth serum, Project MK Naomi focused squarely on lethality and delivery systems.
Exactly. This was a sustained, like, 2-decade collaboration between the CIA and the U.S. Department of Defense. Ran from the 1950s all the way into the early 1970s.
And the primary goal was terrifyingly practical, wasn't it?
Yeah.
To gain comprehensive knowledge on chemical and biological warfare weapons. They were essentially building this massive classified catalog.
They wanted to know precisely what substances would kill people.
Yeah.
And, just as importantly, what substances would cause specific debilitating non-lethal reactions, anything from temporary irritation or amnesia, all the way up to death.
And this comprehensive catalog allowed them to basically choose the right agent for the right target. But once they had the agents, they needed untraceable delivery methods, right? This is where those spy movie cliches truly became reality. They started driving the development of specialized tools.
Right. They developed these really unique delivery systems, focusing heavily on dart guns, darts with specialized chemical coatings, syringes disguised as, everyday objects like pens or umbrellas.
Mm-hmm.
And the ultimate result of this research, which gained notoriety years after the project ended, was the infamous heart attack gun.
Yeah, the existence of the heart attack gun was revealed during congressional hearings back in the 1970s. It was designed to shoot this tiny, specialized dart. potentially laced with a chemical like maybe a massive dose of shellfish toxin or some other highly concentrated cardiac toxin.
Okay.
When fired, the dart would inject the chemical into the victim, leaving only this minuscule, almost invisible pinprick mark, something nearly impossible to detect in an autopsy.
And the chemical itself was engineered to mimic natural causes, right?
Right.
It would rapidly induce a heart attack or massive cardiac arrest, making a very intentional clandestine death appear to be a completely accidental demise from natural causes.
Exactly. In the intense climate of the Cold War, this was basically the ultimate deniable assassination tool. The goal wasn't just to eliminate a threat, it was to eliminate the evidence that the threat had been eliminated.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it just underscores the intense institutional pressure during the Cold War to perfect methods of deniable control and assassination.
Absolutely. The CIA and DoD were operating way outside of ethical constraints, all under this umbrella of national security necessity, perfecting ways to violate human life while maintaining plausible deniability on the world stage. It's chilling.
Now let's pivot from the spy's toolkit of one major global power to a horrifying state-sponsored operation of another, North Korea abducting Japanese citizens. This was a story that for years was just simply brushed off as a conspiracy theory that had absolutely no merit. It just sounded too dramatic, too organized, too brazen to be real.
But it was terrifyingly real. The rumors started circulating in coastal regions of Japan during the late 1970s and early 1980s about people simply vanishing, often young people just leaving no trace at all.
Yeah.
The local police had absolutely no leads, and the central government initially really struggled to reconcile these disparate disappearance cases.
The timeline seems to focus primarily on, roughly, 1977 through 1983. And what makes the victim profile so chilling is that they weren't, typical targets of crime like marginalized populations or anything.
Right.
They were often teenagers or young adults, sometimes taken right off the street or the beach in coastal cities. One of the most famous cases, Megumi Yokota, she was just a 13-year-old girl kidnapped in 1977.
These citizens were, as the reports say, seemingly chosen at random, which just added to the panic and confusion.
The official number recognized by the Japanese government stands at over 17 confirmed victims. Although North Korea only admitted to 13, claiming several had subsequently died. But unofficial estimates from Japanese investigators and NGOs often put the total number of abductions, including non-Japanese victims as well, possibly into the hundreds.
Hundreds.
Potentially. The scale of the covert operation required to pull this off across a neighboring, technically hostile nation. It's immense.
And the why behind it all is just pure espionage training, isn't it? Essentially, yes. The abductees were primarily used as living language and culture teachers for North Korean spies.
Wow.
The agents needed to learn really minute cultural details, specific language dialects, behavior patterns, so they could, quote, acclimate to the culture and eventually blend right in for covert operations likely in South Korea or even Japan itself.
So the victims were basically held captive to train the people who might replace them or spy on their own country.
That seems to be the grim reality. North Korea only admitted to the abductions decades later, in 2002, and only when Japanese investigations provided, as the source says, simply no doubt at all, including evidence from sightings, communications from North Korean defectors, things like that.
And even with the admission.
Even with the admission, the situation remains a diplomatic disaster. Very few abductees were ever returned. The others were claimed to have died under various circumstances, often unverified. The grim reality is that these actions, abducting, torturing, and often killing innocent citizens for political espionage, will likely never be fully accounted for or held accountable, given North Korea's closed state and, its geopolitical insulation.
It's just a profound example of how truth can remain buried under the guise of an outlandish rumor for decades, causing unimaginable suffering to the victims and their families in the meantime.
Yeah, we really need to acknowledge the darkness that permeates some of these subjects. And perhaps nothing illustrates the depths of institutional cynicism better than the state's willingness to sacrifice its own citizens for political gain.
Okay, let's discuss Operation Northwoods, an American military plan that remains one of the most sobering examples of, potential ruthlessness in the 20th century.
The setting is 1962. Tensions with Cuba were, at a fever pitch. Fidel Castro's communist government, aligned with the Soviet Union, was right on America's doorstep. The desire within the Pentagon and certainly parts of the government to overthrow Castro was immense, especially after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion the year before.
Right. So the military brass, head by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they were desperate for a solid, undeniable public pretext to invade Cuba. And the plan they formally submitted was Operation Northwoods. The proposal was simple, yet breathtakingly evil.
Which was?
The U.S. government would carry out a series of fake terrorist attacks on American military targets and civilians, explicitly to blame Cuba and rally public and international support for a massive war.
Okay, this wasn't just some passing suggestion made in a smoky back room.
No, not at all. This is a detailed, formal plan outlining truly deplorable acts. These included things like hijacking planes and then reporting them as shot down over Cuba, sinking boats carrying Cuban refugees fleeing Castro, and even carrying out bombings in U.S. cities like Miami or Washington, D.C.
Bombing U.S. cities.
Yes, and then blaming Cuban agents for the attacks. They even discussed creating mock funerals for fake victims to really drum up public fury.
That detail about the mock funerals, that's crucial, isn't it? It shows this level of planned theatrical deceit, designed specifically to manipulate the entire American populace into supporting a war based on a complete fabrication.
Yeah, the sheer depth of consideration for sacrificing one's own people to achieve political ends. That's what's truly alarming here.
But here's the pivotal moment, right? The twist that saved everyone from this potential horror. Operation Northwoods never actually happened.
Right, and why? Well, it wasn't some sudden surge of morality within the Joint Chiefs. President John F. Kennedy rejected the plan outright.
And his reasoning.
Kennedy was, at that specific time, extremely wary of provoking an all-out nuclear exchange, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis had just happened. He viewed the proposed attacks as just too risky. He feared they would be exposed, or worse, trigger a large-scale war against the Soviet Union.
So his concern was more strategic, perhaps, than purely ethical, which is kind of a chilling detail in itself.
It is, and this plan remained completely secret until 1997, when the documents were finally declassified and made public. Imagine sitting on that truth for over 3 decades, the knowledge that the highest levels of your government formally contemplated bombing American cities and killing Americans just to manufacture a war.
Unbelievable.
Now, let's move from a fake attack that was rejected to a fake attack whose deception was successfully used to justify a war.
Yeah.
The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964. This was the primary catalyst for the massive escalation of the Vietnam War.
Yeah, this event is really a textbook example of how intelligence can be actively manufactured, or at least manipulated, to achieve predetermined political outcomes.
The initial incident on August 2nd, that part was real, though relatively minor. The U.S. destroyer USS Maddox was conducting intelligence patrols in the Gulf of Tonkin, and it encountered 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats. There was an exchange of fire. The Maddox apparently fired first, took a single bullet hole in return. The North Vietnamese boats were heavily damaged. It was basically a minor conflict, likely based on North Vietnamese suspicion of covert U.S. operations happening in the area.
Right. But the real fabrication occurred 2 days later, on August 4th, 1964. Reports started coming in claiming a second attack on the USS Maddox and another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy.
And this claim was based entirely on what?
Misinterpreted, conflicting radar signals, sonar noise, maybe some garbled communication intercepts, made worse by stormy weather and probably very nervous crews.
Crucially, the captain of the Maddox, a guy named John Herrick, was instantly suspicious. He actually reported back that he could not confirm any visual sighting of enemy vessels, and the sonar contacts were likely, quote, freak radar echoes.
So the guy on the scene was doubting it from the start.
Exactly. Yet this immediate skepticism was either ignored or, more likely, actively manipulated by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and others in Washington, who were eager for justification to escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The intelligence was intentionally distorted, cherry-picked to confirm the attack.
And investigations years later confirmed the truth, didn't they? No North Vietnamese forces were present near the U.S. ships that night. The alleged second attack simply never happened.
It never happened. But that manufactured lie was instantly broadcast as a blatant act of aggression against the U.S. military.
And the consequence was immediate and, well, catastrophic. Congress, fueled by this manipulated intelligence, passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which essentially gave President Johnson a blank check to conduct full-scale military operations in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war.
And this led directly to massive troop deployments, the bombing campaigns, the intensification of the Vietnam War, a conflict that defined a generation and cost millions of lives.
And the declassified documents confirming the deliberate manipulation to escalate the war. They didn't surface until long after the conflict was over. This incident just serves as such a grim warning. When the pressure for intervention is high, The official narrative surrounding any incident should always be subjected to the absolute deepest scrutiny.
Okay, we've covered manufactured horror, deniable assassination, state-sponsored kidnapping. Our final segment deals with, I think, the most profound ethical failures and intentional harm directed at citizens, highlighting the absolute darkest corners of government action documented in our sources.
Yeah, these next two entries really highlight intentional malfeasance and the severe abuse of scientific authority, even when operating in the name of supposed public good or national security.
Let's start with the U.S. government poisoning alcohol during Prohibition. Now, from 1920 to 1933, the sale and consumption of alcohol was prohibited. But the government wasn't just relying on law enforcement to curb drinking. They took a proactive and ultimately lethal step.
Right. During Prohibition, industrial-grade alcohol, the kind used in paints, fuels, solvents, other legitimate products, was often diverted and redistilled by bootleggers to make illegal drinking alcohol. It was a huge black market. To combat this, the U.S. government actually ordered the intentional addition of methanol, basically a deadly poison, into these industrial alcohol supplies.
And the government's justification was what? Some kind of radical deterrence.
Essentially, yes. They theorized that deaths caused by this tainted alcohol would deter bootleggers from selling it and maybe deter consumers from drinking it. They thought the risk of death would finally curb demand.
But that theory completely failed to account for the reality of addiction.
Right.
And just basic economic demand.
Completely. Bootleggers continued to sell the now poisoned alcohol, often trying to mask the taste somehow. And people struggling with alcoholism continued to consume it, often knowing the risk but unable to stop. The tragic result was entirely predictable. Thousands of Americans were poisoned and died directly because of this government policy.
The statistics are just horrifying. In 1927, in New York City alone, there were over 41 confirmed deaths attributed just to this tainted government poison supply. And national figures estimate the total number of victims who died from this policy was probably in the thousands throughout the Prohibition era.
It just raises this devastating ethical question, doesn't it? How did the government justify intentionally putting deadly chemicals into a product they knew desperate people would illegally consume?
Yeah.
The sources point toward a really shocking calculus. They apparently had options for non-lethal deterrence agents that would make the alcohol taste intensely bitter or repulsive, rendering it undrinkable but basically harmless.
So why weren't those used? Why choose death?
Well, the likely reason, confirmed through historical documentation and analysis, seems to be that those non-lethal additives might have rendered the industrial-grade alcohol less effective for its primary industrial purposes.
You're kidding.
No. Essentially, the government prioritized maintaining the commercial and industrial utility of the substance, keeping production costs low and efficiency high for manufacturers over the lives of the citizens they were supposedly trying to protect from illegal consumption. It was just a cold, utilitarian calculation that resulted in state-sponsored death.
That is exceptionally chilling. Okay. Now, we arrive at what is probably the most morbid and ethically devastating subject we are covering today. Project Sunshine, which became morbidly known, for good reason, as the Dead Baby Project.
Yeah. Project Sunshine was a secret research project launched way back in 1953 by the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. Its goal was seen as critical to Cold War strategy, studying the long-term effects of radioactive fallout on human health, especially after all the extensive nuclear testing that was going on.
And specifically, they were focused on strontium-90.
Right. Strontium-90 is often called the deadliest byproduct of nuclear detonation. When it gets into the body, usually through contaminated food or water, it behaves chemically a lot like calcium.
There goes to the bones.
Exactly. It accumulates heavily in the bone marrow. And the danger is particularly acute for children whose skeletal systems are rapidly developing. That made them the most vulnerable, and thus, from the researcher's perspective, the most valuable study population for analyzing the long-term effects of radioactive exposure.
But since they couldn't ethically or legally subject living children to radioactive material,
they decided to conduct their study by gathering thousands of human samples, primarily the cadavers, the bodies of babies and young children, critically, without the knowledge or consent of their families.
This is where the operation becomes truly stomach-churning, isn't it? To gather the vast numbers they felt they needed, the team established this international acquisition network. They gathered over 1,500 samples, often sourced from outside the United States, including countries like Australia and the United Kingdom, where oversight might have been laxer or easier to circumvent.
And the acquisition methods themselves were just disgusting, as detailed in the exposure reports years later. To prevent detection by grieving families, parents were often actively prevented from viewing the entire body of their deceased child before burial or transfer.
Oh, my God.
And to further hide the purpose, the fact that bone samples were being taken, the deceased children were, in some documented cases, sent back to families or undertakers in parts, like missing a leg or having other specific bones removed. Things that would be harder for grieving families to detect if viewing was already restricted or discouraged.
That sounds like something straight out of a horror film. Yet it was documented reality, justified under the extreme secrecy and perceived urgency of the Cold War and nuclear arms race.
And once the practices of Project Sunshine were finally exposed, beginning primarily in the late 1970s and early 1980s, they were met with absolute widespread international outrage. Understandably.
I should hope so.
This public horror directly fueled the implementation of far stricter international ethical standards for scientific research involving human subjects, whether living or deceased. It really highlights the absolute necessity of robust public and legislative oversight in scientific endeavors, especially when national security is invoked as a justification.
Okay, wow. Let's try and unpack this monumental journey we've just taken. We've covered government-sponsored discrimination built on ridiculous pseudoscience.
The fruit machine.
We've seen assassination disguised as heart attacks. We've explored the systematic kidnapping of foreign citizens just for spy training. And we detailed formal plans to bomb one's own cities and manipulate intelligence just to start full-scale wars.
Operation Northwoods, Gulf of Tonkin.
And we finished with the intentional poisoning of citizens during Prohibition and the secret dismemberment and exploitation of deceased children for nuclear testing in Project Sunshine.
It's quite a list. The unifying theme, really, is the extent to which powerful institutions, particularly governments and militaries operating under the cloak of secrecy, will plan, execute, or at least seriously consider actions that are just profoundly immoral, illegal, and destructive to human life and dignity. And all rationalized by paranoia or strategy or some perceived necessity. These cases, they aren't folklore, are they? They are tangible, documented proof that authority is not inherently benevolent or even trustworthy.
It's so easy, isn't it, in this age of just information saturation, to dismiss crazy claims out of hand. If something sounds too ridiculous or maybe too evil to possibly be true, our reflex is often just to assume it's hyperbole or, fake news.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, the entire history of these proven conspiracy theories really underscores the vital importance of sustained skepticism and critical thinking. They remind us that the official narrative is often heavily censored or massaged or outright manipulated.
Right.
And sometimes that most outlandish claim you hear, that might be precisely what was happening behind closed doors. These stories tell us what the powerful are capable of when they believe they are operating without scrutiny.
The reality is that all the horrifying things we covered today, every single one, were at one point just whispers, just rumors shared between the skeptical and maybe the paranoid, dismissed by the masses as just absurd fantasy.
So stay curious, I guess. Always demand the documentation where you can, and remember the history we just reviewed.
Because the official story, it always needs a footnote. Maybe quite a few footnotes. We just found a few thousand pages worth.